Welcome to This Week in Health IT, where we discuss the news, information, and emerging thought with leaders from across the healthcare industry. This is episode number 29. Today we do a deep dive. This one is into cloud infrastructure and migration with our sponsor, HealthLyrics. Find out how to leverage the cloud to new levels of efficiency and productivity. Visit healthlyrics.com to schedule your free consultation. My name is Bill Russell, recovering healthcare CIO, writer, and advisor with the previously mentioned HealthLyrics. Before I get to our guests and update on our listener drive, I recorded a brief segment yesterday with Shauna Smith, the Executive Director for Hope Builders, and I'm going to play that right now for you. As we're coming to the close of our campaign in support of Hope Builders, an organization that gives disadvantaged youth the job training and life skills that they need in order to succeed, I wanted to share a little bit more about the organization with everyone. Today, I'm joined by Shauna Smith, the Executive Director of Hope Builders. Good morning, Shauna, and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Bill. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm really excited to have you here. Our great community, as I shared with you, of listeners has responded and raised close to $2,000 for Hope Builders over the last couple of weeks. We still have a couple more weeks in our campaign where our sponsor has agreed to give $1,000 for every 100 new podcast listeners or YouTube subscribers. And I just thought this is a great opportunity to connect with you and give the audience a little bit more idea of what you guys do. So I'm just going to throw it to you with, tell us a little bit about Hope Builders. Where'd you come from? Who do you serve? And what are you doing in the community that we live in?
Well, I think I'll start with the where we came from question, because it's a really, I think, compelling one and a unique one, actually. Almost 25 years ago, a group of 4 Catholic nuns, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange, were living in a really tough neighborhood in city of Santa Ana in Orange County, California. Not always a place thought of as a place of high need, but there are definitely dense pockets of that. And that's especially true in the early 90s, when gun violence and youth violence were really prevalent at that time. And the sisters were really caught in the middle of that and realized that for many young people, there weren't a lot of options outside of the neighborhood. And so they were compelled into action, and as is their tradition, they engaged the community, and 23 years later, we're serving close to 600 young people a year, providing workforce training, really seeing jobs as a great vehicle for helping young people who are really disenfranchised move out of poverty and build lives of self-sufficiency for themselves. So that's really what we focus on.
You find these youth that are struggling, and you give them a second chance. So how do you identify them, and how do you, and what does your program do for them?
So we really try to seek out those young people who aren't in school, they aren't in work. We're particularly focused on young adults. So that 18 to 25, 26-year-old who's struggling and stuck, maybe not in work or in a minimum wage job going nowhere. And where we are in Southern California, like many parts of the country, it's very high cost of living. So we want to ensure these young people get into the workforce. And we're particularly focused on 4 industries: construction, healthcare, IT, and business. We provide training, and then we partner with local employers to provide them employment opportunities, which really kind of help enrich and grow their businesses. So it's a win-win for both the youth and our local employer community.
Well, hey, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, and then it's such a great opportunity for us to support. And I really appreciate our listeners who have subscribed to the podcast and our sponsor for giving that money. We have another 4 weeks of the fundraiser going. So I would, just encourage people to share it with their friends, and let's see if we can drive the number higher. And thanks again for coming on, Shauna. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks to you and your listeners for your generosity and the opportunity to share about our good work. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate Shauna coming and joining me, and I also really appreciate our listeners that have spread the word about the show, and we really appreciate it. As I said, we've raised $2,000. We hope to raise more in the next couple of weeks, and we appreciate everything you guys do with regard to that. So today's guest is Robert Rice, who is the chief everything, chief architect, chief technology, chief guru, chief operating officer for HealthLyrics. Rob and I have worked together for a while. Good morning, Rob, and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you.
So you have an interesting background. You've worked in a lot of different industries besides healthcare. What are some of the other industries you've worked in?
So I started in finance, and then prior to healthcare, I worked for the entertainment industry. So the Walt Disney Company, for example.
Walt Disney Company. So you work for Disney. What's it like to work for Disney? Is it as magical as we would think?
It's a lot more intense than magical. Yeah.
It's intense for the people that make it magical for the people who are visiting, I guess.
Yeah.
What's the craziest IT project you ever had to pull off at Disney? Just out of curiosity.
It's not that there's one intensity over the other, it's size, right? So for example, an identity project at a normal large institute might have 100,000 identity accounts. At Disney, it was about 2 million identity accounts. So just sheer volume alone caused you to rethink and relook at the way you're doing things.
Wow. Was there anything about the characteristics in terms of downtime? I mean, I would assume Disney had like a zero tolerance for downtime kind of situation.
Yeah, and it was baked in the culture, right? Everybody knew that we worked when most people were off, so we had to make sure that we didn't impact that. And it was kind of mantra that you only have one time to get right for the user experience, for the family experience. So we kind of measured thrice, cut once.
Yeah, so that was good training for you to come into healthcare. So then you came into healthcare. You actually joined me at St. Joe's in Orange County, and that's really going to be the gist. We're going to talk a lot about that time there. And then when the Providence merger happened, you and I went off. And full disclosure, we are partners in HealthLyrics, and we've been doing cloud migrations now really since about 2010. Not only with St. Joe's, but with other health systems, and that's the gist of this. So this is a deep dive episode, which means we take one topic and really explore it. We've done this before with AI, and now we're going to do this around cloud computing, but more specifically, we're going to focus in on cloud infrastructure. We could talk about cloud data models and some other things, but this one's going to be about cloud infrastructure. I'll do the setup, and then we can move deeper into the process. As you know, as I said, Rob and I have a lot of the same shared experience with this. Plus, some of this, my talking more on this episode is just going to be just sympathy for Rob because his plane got into LAX after midnight last night. So we really appreciate. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Maybe not at the top of your game right now, I guess. So. So let's start off with a quote. This is pretty recent. This is happening this morning. So Dale Sanders, president of technology with Health Catalyst, had this to say on LinkedIn this morning, roughly 35 minutes ago. If and when I ever return to the CIO role in healthcare, I'll race as fast as possible to move my data centers to the public cloud. There's no way I can provide the same capabilities on any dimension with my data center. Even the data centers like Via West can't come close to matching Azure, AWS, et cetera. And I think it's interesting. I think you're seeing a lot of, John Halamka had on the show also had similar comments about the capabilities and things that are available in the cloud. So let me set this up. So let me put a little definition around it. I came in as CIO in 2010. I looked at the organization, looked at Rob, and said, we're going to here are the characteristics of cloud that we're looking for. And this was back in 2010. Not a perfect definition, but it sets the groundwork. We said it has 5 characteristics. First, self-service provisioning from anywhere. So web-based provisioning really from your phone, from Alexa, from self-service provisioning from anywhere. That was number 1. Number 2, rapid elasticity, which meant you could scale up and scale down. Now, scaling up was not that big of a deal back then, but it was somewhat. Sometimes you had to add crack units and air conditioning and power to your data center, in which case it was millions of dollars. Other times you had to add servers, took a lot of time. But one of the things that we were looking at when I came in 2010 was the ability to scale down. We kept asking the organization for tens of millions of dollars for new data centers and whatnot. And they were saying, okay, hey, we're actually selling off portions of our business. Can we have some of that money back? And the answer is no. So cloud gives you the ability for self-service provisioning and rapid elasticity. So scale up, scale down. Meter service, pay for what you use. So one of the benefits of the cloud is if you have 1,000 users today, you pay for 1,000 users. If you have 800, you're paying for 800. But even more than that, the services are much more granular. So you're only paying for the storage you need and the compute you need. And now it goes all the way down to, much, AI and other things as well. The fourth thing was programmatic access to resources. This is where we get into the DevOps. This is where a lot of your efficiency comes in. And then the fifth thing was granular accounting, to the point where AWS now, you can do compute by the minute. So for those of you who are wondering what you would use that for, sometimes you have processing that's done at night. You could scale up 100 servers, use them for 10 minutes, do all your processing, scale them back down, and only pay for using those servers for 10 minutes. So granular accounting. So self-service provisioning, rapid elasticity, metered service, programmatic access to resources, and granular accounting. And like I said, that not a perfect definition, but it sort of set up what we were looking to accomplish. We were looking to get agility, efficiency, and automation within our health system. So we thought the cloud was going to bring us really two important things. First, in 2010, when I came in, we interviewed a lot of the executives and said, where is healthcare going? And the most common response was, we don't really know. We know that there's a lot of change coming, pop health, value-based care, mergers and acquisitions, new competition, Silicon Valley was coming in. One of the things is, when you don't know what's next in your industry, you need to create something that you're able to make quick moves. You're able to adapt very quickly. And so cloud gives you that ability. The second thing we knew is that healthcare was moving outside the walls of the traditional health system. So we used to have data centers which served our 23,000 staff. But that wasn't going to be the case moving forward. We were going to start putting devices all over the place. We also had clinics, critical access facilities, long-term acute care facilities, more and new types of partnerships. So that not only were we looking at 23,000 endpoints, we were now looking at literally millions of endpoints accessing resources from our data center. And the cloud lent itself pretty well for that. So one last piece of background, Rob, before we get going. So just to give people a little idea of where we started our journey, our scenario was pretty challenging. We had, here's some of the statistics. So 50% of our data center equipment was end of life when we started our project. 60% of the workstations were also end of life. 1,800 instances of 900 distinct applications, which is not the worst we've seen in the industry. I know you and I have seen organizations, when we say 1,800 instances, they just go, oh, well, that's nothing. We have 10,000. And you just sort of shake your head like, that's almost impossible to manage 10,000 instances of distinct applications. But we had 900 distinct applications. We had 15 million in data center upgrades that needed to be done. And the data center, I mean, this is the real thing here. The data center had just gone down 8 times in 6 weeks prior to my arrival as CIO. It's actually one of the things that precipitated my coming in as CIO. So, and the other thing I will give people, just because it gives a picture of our relationship. I was the unreasonable CIO. You were the VP of infrastructure and operations. And I looked at you and said, hey, get our data centers to the cloud. And oh, by the way, here's one last thing. You can only have 2 racks per hospital, and they have to be self-contained racks and not need data centers. And I remember, actually, I told the team that before I hired you, and they looked at me and said, that's not possible. And then when I brought you in, I said, hey, here's the requirement. And I thought you were going to tell me the same thing, and you looked at me and said, oh, yeah, piece of cake. Yeah, we can do that. So we'll shed some light on why that was a piece of cake and actually how you exceeded that expectation, which was pretty interesting. All right, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Great. So we've set it up. Obviously it's a picture perfect environment. Most of the stuff's end of life. Data centers going down. You come in as VP of Infrastructure and Operations, and we have this cloud strategy. So you take the cloud strategy, but one of the things that we talked a lot about is we're not moving to the cloud for cloud's sake. We're looking to really derive benefits for a healthcare organization. Let's start out there. So what are some of the benefits that a healthcare organization will get from moving to the cloud?
There's so many. Where to start? Right, and first and foremost, it gets you out of the plumbing, like IT plumbing. You're a healthcare business. You're not an IT business. You shouldn't be there. And we don't do it well, right? Because we don't attract the level of talent that we need. Because honestly, right, most of that level of talent wants a Google, wants a Disney, wants an Amazon on their resume. for
Yeah,
that.
and
But
in fairness, we were in Southern California, so we were competing with literally with Google, with startups, with Disney, and others. So it was a tough labor market.
right, exactly. But the beauty is the application stack is also not very complex in the grand scheme of things. So it lends itself easily to get yourself out once you get over that one kind of emotional hurdle is, I need to own the servers.
Yeah, and we did have people that wondered, if we move to the cloud, how are we going to walk into the data center? I mean, how did you address some of those concerns? And I mean, the benefits far outweigh that, being able to walk into the data center.
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, right? It's understanding and proving, do we know what we need to know, and what do we don't know, right? And kind of funny speak, but the basic ism for it is, what is our footprint? What are we actually managing? And what do we think we know versus all that shadow stuff that we know that doesn't exist? Once you start getting your hands around that, for us, it becomes an easier picture to paint that we probably don't manage enough of it already. So it's easier to start kind of boxing up and shipping out.
Yeah, between you and David Baker, who we had on the show earlier, between you and David, you guys kept reminding me that, it's not compute storage and those things that people buy. They buy what they want from IT is uptime, ease of use, access. They're buying services, and so much of our challenge up front was to get IT to think different, get the culture to think different of what's the best way to deliver service to the organization, not what's the best way to get, storage, compute, and all that stuff to the business.
Right.
Yeah, it was an interesting cultural change. So we saw financial benefits. Once you get to DevOps and everything's programmatic, we went from 35 down to 5. Uptime went up. The overall costs were more tied to the level of the business. And then I think the other thing that people are surprised to hear is that our availability actually goes up in the cloud. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But, you have disaster recovery capabilities that aren't available in traditional models that you were able to leverage on a regional basis and on a system-wide basis, which were pretty interesting. So, all right, so we'll step into the process here. So, and again, this is the process that you gave me way back when. There's really 3 movements to get us to the cloud. One is to establish a business case. Second, to architect and plan, and then the third to migrate and operate. And under each one of those, there's a handful of steps and movements, and we're going to touch on those. So the first thing under establish a business case, you have a readiness assessment, and I think the thing that people will be interested to hear is not every health system is ready to go to the cloud. So why is that? Why do you think? What makes one health system more ready than another to move to the cloud?
I don't think we've ever talked about this, right? And at least the simplicity of it, right? I think the context is organic growth versus, measured growth. On that, most health systems that I've seen have grown organically. Like, I'm going to buy this system or that system or that system, and just keep adding on to the Band-Aid ball. But as opposed to, logical and methodical growth. We know we're going to grow by a factor of X year over year, and we're going to plan for it. And I think that's kind of really at the epicenter of why, from what I've seen. Because coming from other industries, we've done that. It's coming into healthcare. I've yet to see that logically thought through.
Yeah, I think the other thing we've noticed is that some health systems still don't have a handle on the basics, on the basics of blocking and tackling. So when we go in there, like for example, when I came in as CIO, I asked, okay, I would like a list of all the organizations that we're connected to and what data we're sharing. That took almost 6 months to a year for me to get that list. So organizations that have trouble with the basics of, hey, can we have access to this data, this information? Do you know where your contracts are? Those organizations need to, not that it's an insurmountable hurdle, because we got through it. And, but being able to have access to that data, even though it's, a lot of times we can just take raw data and process it. Just knowing where it is and having access is one of the things. So, what are some other things you found in terms of organizations being ready?
I think process maturity is a key, right? So standardization, and this is not process for process sake, is do you have standard repeatable processes that a large portion of your staff follow? And in a lot of cases, that doesn't exist. And that's the baseline for building blocks of automation and kind of growth from that. So, building on what you said, like asset management is one key, but do I have standardized procedures for patch and reboot or change or things like that? So if it's measured and applied consistently across a larger part of the organization, you're much more mature and ready to take those leads rather than you have to set those building blocks into place first.
So if they've done ITIL and those kind of things, you're going to be in good shape, I would assume.
Right.
All right. So the next step is to establish the point of truth. And, I found this interesting because, for me, you came in and started dumping all this information on me, and it didn't match with what the organization had told me, prior to you doing this deep dive into our information. And to be honest with you, I was a little defensive because I'm looking at, we had just done a Microsoft agreement based on information that Microsoft had given us. So they had come in and done an audit and said, hey, here's all the stuff you have. Here's what you should license. So that's what we licensed. And then you came in, did this deep dive and came in and said, hey, you over licensed by about $1.5 million. And I got defensive because I'm like, how can you say that you know more than Microsoft, who has all these tools on my environment? But give us an idea of what it means to establish the point of truth and how you get to really that starting point for the cloud migration.
So a lot of your, we'll say your source logical systems have the data of how you actually use IT from a licensing perspective or a consumption perspective. So Active Directory, for example, in there you have every user that's going to log in and every account that's going to do it, but not every account is active. So when you start looking at it, like how fast and frequently do I actually decom or kind of terminate my accounts in there? And that was one of the problems that we had is, we had approximately 50,000 Active Directory accounts, but 15,000 of them have been fallow for multiple years, meaning that we don't use them at all. So we were licensing for the wrong amount for that. The same thing applies, in most other areas, right? So we never do a good job of rationalizing down. Right? We can buy, we could acquire, we could build, but what's our lifecycle management process? And that's kind of one of those, easy sacred cows to go after first and foremost, to say, how much have we been decommissioning over the years, which is almost rarely done.
Yeah, I think I found it interesting that you go after source data. I mean, you literally are just saying, hey, just dump me the raw. I just want the raw data out of Active Directory. I want to look at the physical contracts. You really, this process, you go back, and one of the things you sort of drove home to me is that every report I'm seeing has a bias or a purpose or a bias, right? It has a bias to make something look a certain way, or it has a purpose that it was designed for, and I might be using that report for a different purpose. So talk about why you go back to source data and how, and why that doesn't take forever. I would think if you go to source data, it would just take forever to get that done.
Well, I mean, and you're right, and that was part of our journey together too, right? It's that generic performance and asset reports are just that. They're generic. They don't apply to the way you actually use it. They apply to the way the tool is done. So when you look at the problem from a tool perspective, you're solving a problem with a hammer when you actually need to build a house. When you go to the raw of the data, you're looking at actually how you're using it, and which is really the key, which takes a little bit more time up front, but it moves a lot faster once you lay out all the cards. So like when you're solving, putting together a puzzle, for example, you typically look at the edges rather than starting in the center. And that's kind of the approach that you have to kind of look at it. Like, how am I actually using it, and what am I actually doing with it first, which allows us to move faster once you get the edges of the puzzle figured out.
Yep, absolutely. And so, and then we, you have this point of truth, and then you establish the business case itself, which closes out this first step. And in the business case, you have things like financial models, you have usage, you have skills, you have, I'm actually shortening this up for purposes of the show, but there's a lot of elements of this business case. One of the things that the combination of you and I really works, as people can tell, you're very analytical, and I like to tell stories. And so I really strongly encourage people to tell the whole story of how healthcare transitions in this process. And then you come back with just all this supporting data in terms of how agility is going to play out in the organization, how there are cost savings, even though people need to be aware of the fact it's operational dollars versus capital dollars in a lot of cases, and some organizations struggle with that transition. So we now move into architect and plan, which is the second step that you have here. And the first part of that, I think, is probably one of the more fascinating, which is decompose the applications and the services to core elements. What are you actually doing there?
You're just looking for the commonality across your application portfolio, right? Every application has the same components overall, where the data exists, how does it process, what's the client side look like. So all we're doing is we're taking that and establishing a commonality across the largest portion of the application portfolio that we could start standardizing and really focusing on. Because you're not going to solve a problem individually if you have hundreds of or thousands of applications. You're going to look for the least common denominator across the group, which allows you to do that. So database, for example, most applications have a database. In an on-premise legacy world, you have your production database plus your backup, maybe a high availability one. So now, but from a core conceptual, it's all the same thing. So that allows us to start reducing down and focus and solving the database problem rather than, the 1,000 application problem.
Yep, exactly. It's interesting because I think you had 13. I forget the number of layers, but it was it's everything you would think about. You have the physical hardware, the networking, the virtualization layer. I'm going to get some of these wrong. Storage layer, OS, and whatnot. And when you got done that, one of the big findings I found was you came over and said, hey, we have, it was a couple hundred images. I forget the number. Do you remember the number of server images we had?
It was a little over 200 server image builds. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the things, when you look at it through a different lens, you're able to see this, wow, we have a couple hundred images. Well, that's very hard for an organization to maintain that level. And then when you broke it down even further, I think what your team came back and said is, immediately we can get this down into the teens because of, if we just do some work around the images. And eventually I think the goal was to get it down to 6. Is that pretty close?
Yeah. So about 200 down to 5 common images. And based on that, now you could automate, you could start leveraging efficiencies, because now I'm not spending time chasing after 200 different images across 40,000 server types. I'm chasing down just 5 images, which I can manage the exact same.
And it was really interesting. Before you came in, we were chasing this CMDB nirvana, where we were going to have this CMDB, which would always tell us what was going on in the servers. And you just, you sort of minimize that. You were just sort of like, hey, you know what, if we get down to 5 images, then, it's the CMDB becomes not irrelevant, but becomes, first of all, a lot easier to manage. But second of all, it's one of 5 images. You don't have to figure out all the things that you would normally have to dive deep into a CMDB to figure out. So I found that to be interesting. So the next thing, and this really highlights a mistake that I made prior to you coming in, is the skills matrix and training plan. So I skipped this step. And one of the things people need to know is that the biggest obstacle they're going to get to moving to the cloud is not from the organization. The organization is going to say, hey, I use the cloud at home and I got 25 gig of storage for my email, and I use Dropbox or Box at home, and I have all these capabilities, and they understand that the cloud gives them better services. So they're not pushing back to you when you say, hey, we're moving to the cloud, but IT does. And one of the things that I skipped was the skills matrix part. And because people didn't see where they fit in the organization when all this was done. And so you made a step back. You created, a skills matrix for where we're at today and what skills they would need to develop to get to where they were going. So talk about the process of not only developing the skills matrix, but also having the conversations with the employees and the staff around moving to the cloud.
Well, first and foremost, right, the skill set shifts or elevates up in the cloud because, again, you're not emphasizing deep, heavy engineering skills. You don't need a lot of really core storage depth and knowledge because all you're doing is spinning up gigabytes and terabytes of data at a time here. So as you're building out the skills matrix, what we started realizing was we never really defined what success was from the growth path from a skill perspective. So we de-emphasized planning, design, reporting, those type of skills that you actually really need more so because you need to map out more intensely. So when we created the skills matrix, we rated all the skills that we're going to need in different types of roles on a 1 to 5 basis. And we added in those soft skills and those design skills and those reporting skills that are often neglected that we need to emphasize. So we kind of reset what success was for each individual team and group to say, right now you're engineering heavy, but what we need you to get to is this level. We need you to be able to emphasize, ITIL, service management, workflow mapping, things like that, because that's where it really kind of helped us. And not everybody wants to do that or takes that leap to do that as well. So we gave them a different.
And that was the fascinating thing to me. I mean, you sat down with a significant staff and started mapping that out, and some of them just opted out. You looked at them and said, "Hey, here's where it needs to get to," and they said, "I'm fine. I'm fine working with COBOL." And you're like, "Okay, that's fine, because we're going to have this legacy environment for at least a year, maybe a year and a half, while we do the migration, and we need somebody to take care of it." So, but at the end of a year and a half, we're not going to need COBOL programmers. I'm using that as an example. COBOL programmers. So you've essentially self-opted out over the next 18 months, but but people appreciated knowing that of just, okay, so what you're saying is my job's going to go away in 18 months, but you need me for the next 18 months to get there. And they were really appreciative. And I would just strongly encourage people, do not, it seems so obvious to CIOs, but for some reason I skipped it. You have to show people where they're going to fit in the future state. Otherwise they will fight the process. So,
you also need to identify those soft skills and those kind of intangible skill sets too. Like in a DevOps world, there's no step-by-step guide. So like, how do you identify your innovative thinkers, your testers, your tinkerers? Because part of the process is learning, self-learning. And if you need a, CBT or a training module to do that, you're probably not the right fit for that kind of role. Yeah. And so some of the best people we found came out of the most unlikely places when we started doing that.
Yeah, it always surprised me where you were moving people around, and I'm like, yesterday that person was doing that, and now you have them doing that? Are you kidding me? And you're like, no, let me tell you how these things match up. This is, this is the new world. And I think the other thing was we just had a conversation with a client, with a potential client, actually, I should be honest there. So with a potential client, and they were saying, are you saying in the DevOps world, I'm going to have to hire all these programmers? Because that's going to be really hard for me. And I think why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a common misconception.
Yeah, I think it's the inverse is true, right? It's like once you have DevOps, you're going to plan to lose them, right? Because they are going to the bigger names. They're building, their references and their resumes based on that. So what you have to do is kind of create more of the grooming and training model, just like we talked about before. It's like, how do you invest in the people that need the time to learn and train and develop their skills to do it? Because you can't compete with those big guns in the industry for that. Yeah. So when you kind of give them a growth path to do that, you have the ability to really kind of build that skill set.
And then the other thing we're finding is that the tools are becoming more configuration based and less, hardcore coding based, right? So it really is going into an interface and clicking on a couple of things, and then boom, you've just stood up a whole bunch. Not that you don't need a couple of those hardcore programmers who really understand how the underlying framework works, but a lot of the tools are moving higher up into the presentation layer. So people who just understand how that entire stack works can make that stuff work.
Yeah, like when we started, we used to, and I'm talking like earlier, mid 2005-ish or so, you had to have core development skills in order to do this. But now, like 50 to 75% of the work is configuration based. There's still an element of development in DevOps, but now it's kind of funneling higher and higher.
Yep, absolutely. So the next thing, and probably the sexier thing here, is establish a digital architecture, security models, and align workloads with the appropriate deployment models. And what we talk about a lot here is that each cloud will look a little bit different from client to client based on what they're trying to accomplish. But you do have 5 primary environments that you consider today. Can you so walk us through the 5 environments again? I mean, you gave us, so there's a legacy environment. Anyway, I mean, you know what list I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the legacy environment is just acknowledging the reality that not all your systems are going to lift out on that. So you have to maintain systems in a legacy environment.
So why is that? Is that just because of the way they're written and the way they function today? They're just not going to go to a cloud environment?
Yes, right. So there are some devices that still require direct physical connection. So in the health industry, biomed devices, because you're just not going to get out of them anytime soon. Then there's the larger ones that are critical systems like your EMR that your vendor won't support different processing models, right? Because they're monolithic in nature. So you may as well just acknowledge them, put them in the corner, and then come back to them in a couple of years' time. Here, and then focus on the other. Right?
Okay.
You're scattered.
So the first one we have is a legacy environment. Walk us through the rest.
Yeah. So the next level up is you have applications that are still server-based, but they're virtualized. So a virtualized server can exist anywhere. It doesn't have to exist in your data center for the most part. So, and those are the next target to move out into infrastructure as a service. So your Azure VM hosting, your AWS instances, but they're still server-based. So you're building server instances for that. And then when you take the next step beyond that, now you're focusing higher up, which is more workflow-based. So you're going after software as a service platforms, which everybody has right now. So whether you're using Salesforce or Dynamics or other software-based platform, you're focused on workflow there. You're not focused on anything below the workflow for the most part. And that also kind of lends itself to platform as a service too, right? So when you're making those investments into SharePoint Online, into Salesforce, into other CRM platforms, now you have more platforms that I could kind of build different workflows, different processes, different solutions in a single platform instance rather than different software instances. And then ultimately the utopic vision when people get to that level is native development, cloud native development models where you're designing microservices, web services, and the like, but that's typically the end state of a journey.
So the distinction when we go, so every health system will have those 5 components: legacy or a private cloud, infrastructure as a service, software as a service platform, and then cloud native. So what's the distinctive is how much of each of those you're going to use. So some health systems might have 20% legacy, 30% infrastructure as a service, and so forth and so on. But the goal really is whatever that core layer of legacy, we're shrinking that over the next couple of years. We're moving to infrastructure as a service. Even that layer, we're moving to software platform and cloud native. And the reason we're doing that is the levels of efficiency, agility, cost savings, and access to innovation that organizations are going to have by going to the cloud are just significantly more than traditional models. All right, so we create these really cool diagrams. We map out the entire digital architecture, the security model, and we align the workloads to the various layers of cloud infrastructure that we're going to use. Now we're ready to migrate and operate. And this is the easy part, right? So we just have to migrate 1,800 instances of applications. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm being a little facetious here. So here's where you start this process. You start with negotiating agreements and KPIs with the cloud vendors. What are some of the things that a healthcare CIO or healthcare organization should be thinking about when they're negotiating these cloud-based contracts?
I guess first and foremost, to our earlier conversation on like knowing your environment, knowing your instances, when you know how many virtual servers or instances I'm going to need to maintain because I just can't get rid of them, but they're still server based, you can lock in certain pricing models with your vendors, right? So when you're locking in reserve pricing for, I'll use Azure, for example, and say, I know I'm going to maintain 5,000 VMs, you're going to get a very different price point than if you say, I'm going to spin up instances willy-nilly, and it's a vast order of magnitude too. So knowing what your reserve pricing and forecast will be, say, I know I'm going to maintain this for at least 3 years, allows you to negotiate very differently than just kind of winging it and then going into it. So again, back to that very first step, which is knowing your world and what you're going to maintain is going to be key for you.
Yeah.
And then from there, just kind of peeling back to your usage case and models.
Yeah. Well, and some of the things that we talk about a lot is you can't outsource security because you have a background in security. So you can't outsource security. So you need to negotiate that in. So understand the HIPAA requirements, understand any PCI requirements you have, and you have to be able to provide the reports and pass through all the way down. So you can't outsource it. You're still responsible. You still have to be able to supply that. The other gotcha that I think people don't think about is, especially with cloud applications, like where you're moving vast amounts of data into these cloud environments. Make sure you can get it out. When you're negotiating these contracts, not only make sure you can get it out technically, make sure you can get it out financially. I know that some of these clouds, it's interesting. They'll literally send trucks out to pick up your data, bring it to their data center, and pump it in. And some of that service is almost free. But to get it out, they hit you with bandwidth costs and all sorts of other stuff, and it costs a fortune to get it back out. So be careful of those kinds of things. And we only have a couple more minutes, but those are just some of the things off the top of my head that I would say just keep those things in mind. So this is the
another
part
one I would kind of defer out to make sure to emphasize too is the type of data, right? So data that I need fast response on is going to cost very different than data I probably only need, once in a long period. So your PACS imagery, search imaging, for example, which allows you to negotiate different.
Yeah, and when we're looking at the architecture, we're looking at those bandwidth requirements and we're looking at those access requirements, because the more access you need in the cloud, you can pay for very high availability, very high access, very low bandwidth or low latency servers. But if you don't have to, you really shouldn't. So really knowing your workloads and aligning correctly to what you're buying is really important. So here's where I want to spend a bunch of time, because you spend so much time here, and this is where the big payoff is. So you've done all this, you've done this deep dive, you've done all this planning, and now we're getting ready to migrate workloads. And at first migrating the workloads goes a little slow, but then it really picks up pace because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. So give us an idea of some of the things you think about going into migrating to the cloud and some of the processes that you take a look at.
Well, first and foremost, if we're doing lift and shift migrations, the easiest way to do it that we always found is to do a disaster recovery failover. Right? So we create the disaster instance in the cloud, which allows us to create a full production snapshot, everything we need to build the skill, build the confidence, build the expertise for it, and then go through a few iterations of failover without impacting the business. So in those cycles, now we've built everything that we need to at a low price point, at a low impact to the production environment, and got the business to buy in and sign off on it and build our total confidence. And that's kind of probably the primary way that we start the process, because it allows us to kick the tires, allows us to build the confidence and build the models that we're going to need for the full scale migrations.
Yeah, you really encourage people to start with the easy stuff first, because your team is learning a new skill. So you don't want to start with, hey, let's start with PACS. you want to start with something that's pretty small, pretty self-contained, not a complex architecture, and your team's just getting that, building up those skills. And then as you sort of move down the road, then you start doing some of the more challenging, more difficult migrations. But I want to go back to something you said. So you start by standing up a DR environment or a greenfield environment that you can fail over to. That really is one of the secrets that you brought to the process that kept our downtime pretty minimal in this migration process. I mean, because when you can fail over from one to the other, and just sort of switch those users over. Now you're not looking at extended downtimes. And plus, in the process, you're building out DR capabilities for each of these applications as you move forward. So does that work for all the applications or just a certain set of those applications?
In a large portion of them, it does, right? And I would qualify that to say a large portion of them is transparent, right? The user experience is barely a blip on the radar for them. There are some that struggle with that, but architecturally, you identify them way before.
Yeah. And so I think the other thing which you drove home, you and David both drove home to me was this migration process is more of a people and culture challenge than a technical challenge. Obviously, we're bringing our IT staff along. We're training them as we go. But also, you guys built up a pretty solid team with Rachel and the rest of the team, and Rachel, who we've hired at Health Lyrics now, who put together great processes for engaging the end user community. So they engaged them early in the process, walked them through it, talked about the benefits. So that team became really good after you do a couple hundred applications. They actually ended up with an extensive database of everyone in the organization. They knew who the key decision makers were. They were able to engage them at every point within that, and they became a trusted source for that. So do you still see that as a pretty critical team to have in place for this migration?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not worth doing if you don't understand your business and if you're not talking with them, right? Because they're going to define their tolerances. They're going to define their appetites. They're going to tell you, don't bother me these days, but I'm okay these days, which gives you your operating models to build your confidence for them. And there are so many other problems that you find that exist outside normal IT that you win a lot of goodwill just by solving easier problems too. So building that relationship back and forth is absolutely critical.
Yeah, some of the not necessarily seen benefits for us were, I think we got rid of 10% of the applications just by talking to people, just by going out there and saying, hey, we're going to be migrating this application. You're listed as the owner, and they looked at you like, yeah, we don't use that application anymore. You're like, great. And so we didn't know we were doing an application rationalization project, an AppRat project, but we ended up, archiving a whole bunch of data and a whole bunch of applications just in the process. Because as you pointed out earlier, a lot of healthcare just grew over time of, we added this application, we acquired this company, we never really cleaned all this stuff up. And this is a great opportunity to do that. So we get 24 months later. Here are some of the things, we never did spend that $15 million on data center improvements because we didn't need to. We went from server provisioning and people find this hard to believe, but really from 2 to 3 weeks to provision a new server with the processes that we had to almost 2 to 5 minutes to provision a new server. And sometimes our clients find that hard to believe, but to be honest with you, with a credit card right now, I could go online and provision 100 servers in the next 10 minutes on AWS, and I don't even have the requisite stuff lined up yet. So that's the kind of stuff that's available in the cloud. And then the other thing is we got access to a whole bunch of new capabilities. You created the ability to fail over regionally. And some other things. But I want to get back to one thing, because from private cloud, you went into hyper-converged route, which I found interesting. And I came to you and said, hey, no more than 2 racks in every hospital. And I know when I said that to the team, they sort of were incredulous. And I think some of our listeners from health systems are saying, there's no way our health system in that hospital could get down to that number. But talk a little bit about what hyperconvergence was able to do at the hospital level for us.
So all hypercompute is really condensed compute and storage memory power, right? So most applications that exist nowadays are nowhere near the level that you could provide in basically what I could fit under a desk right now. So when we started getting into the applications, and we knew there was these are my toys element to the local staff too. So being able to come in and say, we're not going to take your toys out of there. What we're going to do is just put them in a new case. But that new case now is a fraction of the size, right? So this is kind of the, just the convergence of data and compute. So we found almost immediately that, about 6 U's, which is roughly, 6 to 12 inches of space, could hold hundreds of servers of what you currently have. So getting to that point was extremely easy. And it also kind of won us a lot of different confidences too, by saying we're not moving it out. And once it was in the hyperconverged, our ability to migrate out, if they're calling for the DR stuff, was almost push button easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can go to third parties and be able to migrate out, migrate in as needed. So yeah, you were able to get down to, in a lot of our hospitals, you were able to get down to a half rack. I think the largest was maybe 2 racks. I know you always argued with me on that, but essentially self-contained racks, you didn't have to have a specialty room. You can move that stuff around. And I think that has some DR benefits for it. The other thing is people always ask me, if you're moving this stuff into the cloud, what happens in the case of disaster? So if your connection to the cloud goes, what do you do in that case? And so one of the more ingenious things I think that you and your team came up with was almost a reverse DR process, which is our primary was in the cloud, but we were actually trickling data back down into the local data center, so that if something went down on the network, let's say there was an earthquake in Southern California, the network went down, those hospitals would still be able to run certain core systems because we had trickled the data back. So it was almost a reverse DR kind of thing. Hey, Rob, I want to thank you for, I know you got in late last night. I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's always fun to talk through this stuff with you and to be a part of helping now other health systems to go in this direction. So thanks again. Let's see. All right, so let's close out. So you can follow the show on Twitter at This Week in Health IT, and you can check out our website at thisweekinhealthit.com. Catch the videos on the YouTube channel This Week in healthit.com/video. Please come back every Friday for more news, information, and commentary from industry influencers. We have a great lineup of people over the next 4 or 5 weeks, and we're starting to set our fall schedule as well. So you'll want to check us out every Friday. That's all for now.